All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm honored and quite excited to be having this discussion with Nigel Sheail. And, I'm Jeff Bockman. I lead the oncology practice at Cello Health BioConsulting, previously defined health. Although we won't be just talking to oncology, we'll be having a broad conversation about the current state of the industry, in particular within this context of the past year plus of the pandemic. Nigel?
Welcome, everybody. I'm Nigel Sheail. I'm heading up BD and M&A at Novartis. Super interesting times for the industry. As some of you will know, I've been involved in a number of different pharma companies over the last 20 years. And I've never seen a year like the year that we've just come out from. And so I think this is a highly, very exciting time to be talking about the industry as it is today. And what we might see over the next few years. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Nigel. And I want to thank the host, all the SACS conference team, et cetera. I thought I would just mention, a few numbers that I'm taking from a recent Terea analysis that, we've been talking about, Nigel and I, and, just to show the sheer amount of money flowing through the industry right now. So I'm looking at the most recent 2020 global equity raise information. So this includes, public offerings and follow-on and venture equity. And we're talking about in 2020, about 120 billion, which, looks like it's a 50% increase over 2019. So that's a very significant raise. So amount of money rather. And maybe we'll start there because, one of the key things that we've seen, and I'd be curious to hear, Nigel, kind of your thoughts about that is, at the same time we're having this terrible pandemic going on with all its both very personal and global and economic impacts, we have this absolutely super hot biopharma industry ecosystem going on right now. So I'd be just curious to hear, kind of your high level thoughts about kind of what you think is driving that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeff. I mean, if I go back a year ago, so we were kind of starting the first lockdown in the pandemic, everyone was coming to me saying, this is going to be a great buying opportunity. The companies will be struggling, and valuations will go down, and this must be a great time for big pharma to kind of go shopping. The truth was completely the opposite. This was the hottest year in terms of financing, valuations, IPO, VC raises, and on pretty much all of these metrics, not just a record year, but more than double what we've seen in the previous records. So, super hot marketplace. Now, as you say, that the sort of question is, why is that? And I think there are actually, from my perspective, two drivers of this. The first one is, I really do believe we're in a period of unparalleled innovation. And I think, the pandemic gave the opportunity for the industry, at large to demonstrate the value of that innovation in a very practical and real way. But if I go back sort of 15 years ago, the big concern in the industry was R&D productivity and lack of innovation. And I think one of the underlying, reasons that, capital is flowing into this space is that we have been very successful in driving innovation. And it kind of feels that there's a bit of an exponential growth to that from a pure science point of view. And I think, we shouldn't lose sight of that. Now, in terms of short-term dynamic, of course, the other reality is, the huge volumes of capital, which is in the economic system looking for investment opportunities. And we're certainly seeing, a significant proportion of that channeled into the biotech sector. If we look at, cost of capital to biotech companies, I'm sure it's the lowest it's ever been, and, in single digit territory, which is, from a finance point of view, clearly driving valuation. Now, is that going to change? It feels like valuations are, at levels that seem hard to justify on, basic cash flow principles. If you look a few years ago, a biotech company going public would need to have a portfolio of assets in the clinic and at least one meaningful clinical proof of concept. Sana went public a few days ago. This is a pure preclinical company and has a market cap today of 8 billion. That would have been unheard of, at any point, previously. So, the question then is, how long will this continue? And if you look at it from a pure finance point of view, it feels like the economic drivers aren't going to change anytime soon. So I don't think this will correct in the next couple of years. So I think we are going to see this, support for innovation and access to capital remain, extremely intense over the next few years.
Well, let's unpack this a bit. Actually, I'm glad you referenced Sana. It's in an area that's one of the more interesting ones that I've been kind of thinking and even talking about for the past 2 years, which is what some people call endogenous reprogramming. But this is not a technical discussion, so unfortunately, I'll have to stop myself from getting into that. But in any event, so I want to pick up this idea of that the age of kind of unparalleled innovation. I mean, clearly a switch did not happen between 2019 and 2020. There's been a phenomenal amount of innovation that's been happening over the past decade, which is building on previous decades, accelerating in terms of the speed with which we can do things and the lower cost at which we can do them. Obviously, there's also this whole overlay now of AI and machine learning, et cetera. But it does beg the question of, why this massive jump from 2019 to 2020? And it is easy to point to the pandemic because that is the, most major significant change that we had kind of during that period. So I'm wondering, to what degree do you think the pandemic itself, whether that's a function of the reaction of the overall ecosystem of the industry, so not just industry, biotech, pharma, governments, et cetera, kind of reacting to that and that kind of bleeding over into the kind of the overall perception of the industry? Is it a function of just, there being a lot more time now for everybody to kind of think about things and recognize the innovation that was there, or something else, or all of the above? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so the way I look at it is, if I think about it in terms of, drug discovery, we talk about proof of concept and proof of relevance. So proof of concept, scientifically, does the idea work? And proof of relevance, commercially, is there a place for this asset, that is going to be meaningful? And, the way I look at the pandemic, I think it's kind of a proof of concept and proof of relevance for innovation. It sort of demonstrated in a real-time way to, a much broader populace, what innovation has done and is capable of, and how quickly it can be brought to a meaningful reality, in terms of patient benefit, etc. And actually, I don't think this is the only time that's happened. If I look back over my career, I think when we had the, HIV outbreak, there was a very similar phenomenon where, prior to that, we had this kind of perception that viruses were untargeted. And then we had this intense focus of innovation on, one particular challenge in one particular area. And, miraculously, we suddenly found that we had a whole range of therapy options. Polymerase inhibitors, protease inhibitors, as well as, various attempts to, target the virus in more traditional ways. And I think we saw a similar, although, much less muted effect. And so I think that's one part of the pandemic. I think the other part is just more a financial reality. the challenges of pandemic have changed fiscal and monetary policy in a way that has, pushed money into the economic system. There are clearly areas of the economy which are significantly challenged, and investors are looking for other investment opportunities. And I think that's just a, monetary effect of the pandemic, not something specific to the industry, but more, there is a lot of very low cost, capital in the system looking for investment opportunities at a time when, traditional areas of investment are clearly more challenging. And therefore that's pushed, easy access of money into, areas, like biotech and other tech areas. It's not just biotech. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I want to come back later to, thank you for referring to proof of relevance coined by our founder and now executive chairman.
Exactly.
So, yeah, nicely done. I do want to come back to that in a little bit, but since, right now in terms of this topic about kind of pandemic aspect, so the impact on, the kind of the real-time ability to show people pulling together, the analogy to HIV, I think is interesting, and certainly kind of what's going on kind of financial markets and fiscally. An allied issue there, which we've talked about, of course, is kind of the fostering of collaboration, kind of breaking down walls, whether those are within a company, between companies, between industry and government, or non-government organizations, et cetera. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about that, because we certainly know that there has been, many attempts over the years, and some of these, very big, monetary terms, attempts of, collaborations between industry and academia, et cetera. But, I'd like to hear your thinking about to what degree pandemic changed that, or accelerated that, changed it in kind or amount, and to what degree that change might remain or accelerate.
Yeah, so, I mean, put my cards on the table. I'm a big fan of collaboration. I kind of feel that the whole purpose of business development is to foster collaboration. And I think in general, there is what I would refer to as collaborative advantage, which, I think in the future world is going to be a key to success in most industries, but certainly ours. And that's, bringing together the pace of innovation and change in the broader sense, which is going on in the world, in ways that you can get that collaborative advantage in real time and move forward. So, I'm just fundamentally a believer in the value of that. And I think as, life cycles and the pace of change accelerates, people can't, develop everything themselves. There's going to be much more collaboration in everything that we do. But beyond that, I mean, if we look at our industry in particular, over the last 20 years, I think we've seen, a significant and, long-term change in collaboration between the sort of traditional infrastructure, which I would call kind of academia, venture capital, biotech sector, and large pharma. And, when I started out in BD 20 years ago, you would go to conferences and everybody wanted to be a FitCo. And it's like, we don't want to talk to big pharma. We certainly don't want big pharma investing in our equity. They're going to kind of steal our secrets and go off and reproduce our great ideas. And that's completely changed. Nobody looks at the world in that way today. Everybody sees the value of working together, with the capital from venture, access to academia, entrepreneurial teams in biotech, and the expertise of big pharma. And I think, pretty much it's accepted today that, we need to work together, to make meaningful success. So I think that's kind of happened, and that's a part of the reality in which we work. And then the question now, I think, is, how does that extend to governments, regulators, political systems, and the kind of healthcare system at a societal level. And, I think what the pandemic has shown is that there is a real and significant advantage to looking at that collaboration and working together, we can achieve a lot in record time, which there's no way we could have done under the old system. And, and I think that's a credit to all of those, areas which have been engaged in dealing with the pandemic. So I would hope that, that will have opened everyone's eyes to this kind of, collaborative advantage that we can get working together. Now, having said that, I think there are, some practical realities that we have to keep in mind. At the end of the day, the regulators, need to make sure that drugs are safe and, properly, tested before they get used in a wide context. I think there are ways that we can work together to do this more effectively and better, but there are still some sort of, fundamental differences in terms of, the roles of government and regulator in terms of interfacing with the industry. And there are certain, lines in the sand that have to be maintained and should be maintained. But I think even before the pandemic, we were seeing this collaboration coming. And a great example in Novartis is, we acquired Medco last year, which we have inclisiran or Leqvio, which is a PCSK9 RNA treatment, which, we're in discussion with the UK government around kind of population health approaches, working, with the UK government to support clinical studies so that we can get, mortality benefit studies done effectively and efficiently, and working with them for potential distribution models, which are more like vaccines, where we can get, really a broad coverage of population in a meaningful way. And, that predates the whole pandemic issue. And I do think that regardless of the pandemic, we will see more cases of collaboration between these kind of institutions. I think the pandemic will probably accelerate some of that. But I don't think it's going to radically change everything overnight. I don't think everything will be like COVID in the future.
Well, medicines companies had been a big client of ours. so it goes. That was the good of it. All right, so let's turn to that's kind of a good segue to our kind of last big topic in the time we have remaining, and that is, so with all this money in the ecosystem right now, it raises the question of really, we all, it's easy to see kind of the good, and you even made some allusion to some things that I'm not saying that they're bad, but maybe are questionable, such as very high valuations, disconnected from what historically had driven such valuations. So we're seeing companies with nothing in the clinic. Maybe they had a lead program, seeing multi-billion-dollar IPO valuations. We're obviously seeing very huge raises going on for what some might still call, science experiments to some degree. So I think you called it kind of easy money. So what do you think are the good and the bad consequences of having kind of so much of this money available, in particular available for biotechs?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think it's bad. I think having, investors recognizing the value of innovation and supporting that with real capital, I think is a good thing, and I think, at the end of the day, everything that we do is underpinned by, the discovery of new medicines. And so, I think, big picture, of course, this is good news. It's going to fund innovation, it's going to expand opportunity. And to a certain extent, this money is, largely recycled money. The investors are putting this money in, are investors who had invested in previous generations of biotech companies, which have made, good returns on exits, and they're now, reinvesting in innovation. So, the big picture, this is a good thing. Now, from a practical point of view, good things also come with consequences. And, there are consequences for biotech companies and consequences for pharma. So if I look at this from, my perspective, we have historically tended to really focus going earlier to access scientific innovation and support that you know, in the belief that this was a, you know, better value proposition than, you know, paying the high price for de-risked opportunities down the road. You know, at a certain point, you know, that metric changes. You know, you know, if the, you know, valuation of a company is in the multi-billions and you have a, you know, unde-risked portfolio, there comes a point where it makes sense to wait. And, you know, perhaps more importantly than the value is the number of companies. You know, if I look, you know, today we have, you know, close to 480 biotech companies in the US with market cap more than 500 million. You know, in 2000 it was 66. And, you know, if you look at the pharma industry, you know, we've got 10, 15, you know, large pharma companies, all of which will do, you know, a handful of deals over the next few years. So the reality is, you know, those 480 biotech companies will not all end up in pharma. And, you know, where investors are looking for an exit, you know, I think more and more of these companies will actually, you know, need to plan for and drive an independent future, you know, and that means they'll have to develop, you know, down the road and ultimately commercialize assets. And ultimately, you know, that value will be driven by the cash flow value of the assets in the marketplace. Now, of course, there's a long time between now and then, but, you know, that value path has to kind of make sense all the way along. Every participant along that path is going to want to make a return and want to see a value proposition. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there is a cash flow value, you know, to the business. And we've seen historically that that's a tough transition for biotech companies when they go to market. You know, many instances of companies which are very, you know, progressively and highly valued. And then, of course, the day comes when you're in the marketplace and you're valued on that cash flow value. So I think, you know, biotech companies are going to have to spend more time thinking about, you know, the independent model. And, you know, for pharma companies, you know, we're going to look at these opportunities and, you know, having to be, you know, choosy about, you know, where we can make the value proposition work. And I think what that will at the end of the day do is drive much more collaboration. You know, rather than M&A exits, you know, I think we'll see, you know, companies like Sana, you know, building, you know, multiple strategic collaborations with different pharma companies with different risk sharing models according to the, you know, the disease area that they're looking at. And so I think we'll see a shift away from, you know, M&A exit more towards, you know, BD, licensing, collaboration type deal structures, you know, which is a bit of a reverse. You know, historically, we've been tending towards more M&A clean exits. And I think we're going to swing a little bit back more towards BD collaborative kind of structures.
So with all this amount of money, and again, you know, when I said the good and the bad, I didn't mean bad, but it does suggest that perhaps, as we've discussed, you know, there might be less selective or restrictive bets than one needed to make historically, which raises the question of does the best sign still always float to the top? Does this overall change in the ecosystem change the kind of success attrition rates that we might see? So the good drugs still survive, but there'll just be many more kind of marginal ones that will fall by the wayside? Or will the environment actually foster some of those more marginal ones to survive when they may not have before?
Yeah, so I think, you know, ultimately, you know, it's all about product and the science. Now, you know, if you look at the kind of capital that companies are raising, you know, I see a bit of a distinction between the kind of asset-centric view and the company-centric view. So, you know, typically, you know, pharma companies and the industry has kind of looked at assets. You know, we look at the target, we look at the molecule, and we assess its opportunity. And it's always struck me that this is in contrast to, you know, how investors look. You know, investors tend to look at, you know, the management team, the capability of the company. And when I talk to investors, you know, they'll say, look, you know, we're not really investing in the asset per se. we're investing in, you know, the quality of the team and the quality of the company. And, you know, if we look at the companies that return value in our portfolios, you know, the vast majority of them are not returning that value on the asset that they were focused on when we originally invested in them. And they often reinvent themselves 2 or 3 times before they, you know, find the opportunity that really works. And I think that's one of the plus points with the capital in the system, that companies, you know, are not going to succeed and fail on one asset, but they are going to have the bandwidth to, you know, explore their platform and their technology more broadly. And they'll have the bandwidth to fail occasionally without it being, you know, kind of the end of the road. So, you know, I think ultimately it's the science that will win. You know, the ones that will drive the real value will ultimately be the companies with the great science. But I think many companies will go through iterations of development of their portfolio and their model. And where they are today may not ultimately be the asset that drives the value. It may be the second or third, you know, shot on goal. And the advantage with, you know, the current market is that companies will have that opportunity to, you know, fail a bit. You know, they don't have to make the first opportunity work.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point, because clearly we talk a lot about that with, you know, internally, and, you know, if we judge by the amount of work that we have, which is clearly a reflection of the amount of money in the industry, with many biotechs now having the time and the wherewithal and the desire to think about actually those proper clinical development strategies that lead to POR, proof of relevance, as you said earlier, as to POC. But it is interesting in terms of what you said, because if in fact it does allow them to fail more, then that's a very different equation than there had been in the past, when there was much more risk entailed in, you know, that first major failure. And yes, sometimes they could reinvent and there are other things to do, but, you know, now maybe there are, with that much money, as well as so many more different funding opportunities and ways to spin out and SPACs and all that, you know, there may be new ways to reinvent and pivot, et cetera, for companies that historically might have just disappeared and, you know, been acquired for cash or whatever. We're running out of time here. Any parting comments or?
No, I think it's super exciting time, and you know, I'm sure we'll be discussing again in a year's time, and we'll have some more surprises along the way.
Hopefully many good surprises. So, all right. Well, I want to thank you, Nigel. It's been a great pleasure once again to have the discussion. Thank you, organizers. And we'll look forward to hopefully some virtual Q&A coming in. Thank you.
Thanks.